Great. So now we have Christian Dees, who's doing this video cast with us, and we're going to be talking about the journey of using change data to influence senior executives. So very lucky to have with us Christian Dees, who's now at Salem Consulting. He was previously at Nisource, and he did a lot of great work in leading the whole program around how do we leverage change data to gain insights and influence senior stakeholders from that perspective. So, hi, Christian, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, Ewan. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Had really great experiences working with you and the rest of the team. A little bit more about my background. I started off with Deloitte Consulting and spent about 11 years there, and overall about 16 years in the consulting world. And as you mentioned, we had the opportunity to lead a center of excellence and change management and helping them really standardize what change looked like across the organization and collecting data and metrics to be able to help senior leaders and stakeholders be engaged and understand what's going on with their stakeholders.
Fantastic. Yeah. So, Christian, yeah, we've been doing some work with you when you've been at Nisource for a number of years. Um, And so tell everyone what business problem was NICE was trying to solve at that time, and what were what were they going through? What were the stakeholders telling you? What were they asking for? And what happened that really led to this piece of work?
Yeah, it's a great question. Nisource was going through a tremendous amount of transformational work, including divesting a major part, a sixth of their business from the organization, and really redefining how they did work. So when you think of transformational projects, it doesn't get much more transformational than that. And in the course of those programs, we realized that we needed help. This was a large change effort that we couldn't do internally with three resources. So we brought in various different consulting agencies. And while they all had talented individuals, each group had their own spin on how they did change management. We realized very early on that we needed a standard approach to stakeholder analyses, change impacts, defining what those were. And so we went about setting a standardization across the organization. One of the key things that we did that was really critical was embedding in their statement of work the requirements to fulfill these Nisourceized, if you will, change management deliverables so that we had a uniform way. We were all speaking the same language, singing off the same sheet of music, if you will. So once we had those in place, we were able to really standardize what change looked like, how it felt for the organization, and really what were those levers that we could pull to help mitigate impacts, but also enhance adoption. And we found that data was critical as we were moving through the series of these transitions, these transformations. Initiative after initiative just kept piling on. At the same time, I think at one point we had scheduled for 1 month several 100,000 hours of change impacts to an organization. And this was pre-COVID, so you can imagine once COVID, how much more critical that was for our organization to get a handle on what was changing, who's being impacted, and by how much, and of course when. And that's really when we decided that we needed to have some kind of ability to capture this data and present it in a way that could be impactful to our senior leaders. And we engaged with you and in the Change Compass, and we decided that this was really going to be the best tool for us to both capture what those change impacts were and help our leaders, not only our senior executive leaders. They were extremely interested in it. I had the funny story. I had the opportunity to sit next to our CEO and have a conversation with him about all the changes that were happening, and he was extremely interested in being able to see what was coming down the pike and how it was impacting our frontline workers. For most organizations, the frontline workers are critical to the success of their organization, and particularly when you're putting pipe in the ground, you want to make sure that those people are well taken care of and not oversaturated, not only for their safety, but the safety of the community. So we were talking about this, and it became more and more clear that we needed something to be able to put in front of senior leaders, but also our partners, our sponsors, and our PMs, so they understood kind of what else was happening in the organization, who was being pulled in for what projects and where. So we started with those standardized workbooks that we had, including the requirement to capture these metrics and implement them and put them into the change compass. And we also, I think, you want to talk about like a turning point or kind of a hinge point for us was having them to requiring change practitioners or even the PMs that were fulfilling that change management role to capture those change metrics and enter them into the change compass. Not everything was perfect. I love to say that day one, it was an amazing experience. And really it was from us learning how to capture this data, but it did require a number of, I would say, iterative sessions with the change resources and leadership to understand what was going into it, what was a level 5 impact or what was a level 2 impact, and then what those numbers meant and how they could translate that into, for senior leaders, how they could transfer that into recommendations around how their organization was being impacted. So I know I kind of took us through the whole journey. You and I'll apologize for going off.
Christian, from the perspective of the change practitioners, what were some of the questions? Like in the beginning, what did they ask a lot of questions about, or what were they confused around?
Yeah, so when we were entering the activities, right? So if you're looking at the change compass, we would we call them activities in the change compass. Oftentimes they're called like engagement plan. What are you doing? Whether it's a communication, a learning, a focus group, just an email. Helping them understand that activities were really the engagements that you were using to mitigate, explain, or help users adopt the new change. And so once we found that, that was kind of for us that aha moment where a lot of our practitioners were getting stuck around, these activities are individual and we need to capture each one so that we can properly allocate them across the stakeholders to create an accurate heat map or an amount of change, if you will, for us. And then also setting definitions around what is a 0 to 5 impact, just because you're, I'll give you a really good example. So we had I think it's a good example. I don't know if you will, but we had massive reorganizations as part of our transformation. And so these announcements will come out. And while, yeah, it was just an email and it would take 36 seconds to read, people found that people were spending several cycles digesting this information, who's leaving, who's staying, who do I report to? And so we really bumped that up from a level 1, that org announcement, as opposed to a simple email that you read, to more of a level 4 or 5, where it took them some time, whether it was several weeks, to really digest and integrate that change into their daily work. So that was another one of those challenging aha moments for us.
Yeah, that absolutely, because when there's an org announcement, it's not just reading an email, isn't it? It's really, as you mentioned, digesting what's going to happen, how's my life going to change as a result of that, who are my new stakeholders. It's not just my team, but other teams as well. So there's quite a lot that they're going through. So I think it's a really good call out to mention that what people go through is actually not as little as it seems on paper. So Christian,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh, sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, so yeah, tell us also a bit more about, you mentioned in the beginning the stakeholders realized that there was a lot of changes they were going through. Were they clear in terms of what they were looking for? And what was the kind of journey that they went on in terms of really understanding the data?
Yeah, so what they were looking for is, it's like I said, focusing on very particular stakeholder group, wanting to know how much change was coming down the pike for them and how much that would impact their day to day. And this really started, like I said, pre-COVID, where we had a number of initiatives lined up, and they wanted to know how they could stagger those or maybe even phase those in so that we would minimize or spread the impact across the year. So that's where a lot of the uh, data and reports helped understand, not necessarily down to Joe Smith in Pennsylvania, how much he was getting impacted, but that broader stakeholder group. I don't know if that answers your question, even if that's what you were looking for.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's really informative. And so tell us, as you start to work with them, and then they start to see the data and they start to sort of discuss what that means for their businesses. What was some of the kind of, I guess, the realization? What did they do with the data, and what really happened?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things that came out of this was that the group that was saying that they were the most impacted, the data did not bear that out. It was actually a lot more of the silent majority, if you will, of office employees were much more impacted by a lot of these changes than these frontline workers. They just happen to be some of the more vocal. And so having that data, not just our opinions, right? So we went through and vetted the data with a number of stakeholders to the initiatives. But it was really impactful to show leaders that yes, there is a lot of change, and yes, it feels like a lot for this group, maybe relative to what they're used to. But compared to some of these other groups, these are much higher, and we're potentially at greater risk of losing them through this transformative journey than we might be some other more vocal stakeholder groups. So what that allowed us to do is then set priorities on, and not just set priorities on what was coming when, but also where were there synergies? Where could we blend in a communication? We actually found that we were communicating the same thing to three different groups through three different vehicles. So we were over communicating in a number of instances and found that there were actually some synergies we could bring together and maybe condense some of those learning or communication materials. Leaders, I will tell you, the first time that we presented some of the data, it wasn't as impactful as 2 or 3 times down the road. I found that we needed to almost do a pre-read with them about the data so that they were used to seeing it. And then by the second and third time, they knew what to expect and were able to further dive into kind of some of the nuances there.
Yeah, that's a great point, isn't it? It's a capability journey for them as well to understand what they're looking at, what the data means, how they could use the information, and what are some of the actions afterwards as well, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. It was very important for them to know what they were looking at in order to make those important business decisions.
Mm. And so, Christian, the other thing that I've noticed you guys have done really well is, really engaging at the C-suite, at the senior stakeholder level, and really using change data to inform the decision making. How did that come about, and how did you really get to that stage?
Yeah, so like I said, it really started with the beginning of the conversation with our CEO. Obviously, didn't report directly to him. So once we learned that that was on his radar, so to speak, we worked with our chief human resource officer, and he was kind of our conduit for the rest of the C-suite as we reported directly up through him, and we're able to show him the value of the data and the information in making those decisions and around timing and stakeholder groups, and then that was more broadly shared through the larger C-suite, if you will. So it started with the impetus from on high, but we really had to do a lot of groundwork. So one thing that doesn't show up is we had an IT PMO, and we had to work very closely with them to make sure that they understood the change process and what we would be providing them. I think back to when we started our journey for standardizing our approach to change was our intake form. So anytime somebody had a change that they wanted to come to us with and find support, we would work with them to really identify what was changing and how much support would be needed, and then make a recommendation accordingly. And I think that's what really set us up for success, because if we tried to chase every small minor process improvement, we just weren't enough hours in the day. But really, we could focus our efforts on those larger transformational efforts that needed more change support, that then allowed the senior leaders to see the value of this data and helping their stakeholders really adopt and accept the changes.
Yeah, that's a great point, isn't it? I guess, yeah, absolutely. Starting with the biggest pieces of the pie and really get the traction and the notice from the senior executives before you then go to sort of the rats and mice, if you even go there at all. So I think that's a that's a great call out. Now, have you seen the managers, the senior managers actually make different decisions from the data? Like, have you seen a shift in their work?
Yeah, so especially around, I apologize, it sounds like a broken record, but around staging when the changes come out. We had a transformation office, and we were providing a monthly viewpoint into where and how much change was coming. And it really allowed them to sequence and prioritize some of these projects. Maybe it's not as critical that we get this new tech out to the field as it is to move to a new server or a new Microsoft Office. So it allowed them to prioritize and see, yes, there's a lot of change, but yes, it's needed. So maybe we need to throw more resources at this. So I think there are always a couple of levers you can pull. And one thing I really appreciated from you, Ewan, was that senior leaders don't just need the data, they need some recommendations around what to do with the data. And so coming to them with kind of a armed, this is what the data says, but this is what we're saying you could do about it, some options, I think really helped further and drive those conversations, as opposed to, okay, here's the data, go figure it out. But I think really the value add that we provided was helping them maybe make some decisions and some recommendations.
That's great. That's fantastic. Um, and so I know you've talked a lot about working with the PMO and making those sequencing decisions. Um, do you guys have did you feel like you've got the right governance set up, or did that need to be tweaked as a result of using the change data?
I feel like we did not necessarily have the right governance in place. I think if in a perfect world, we would have had an enterprise PMO, and I
Right.
believe that they're driving towards that at this point. Where we were kind of in flight and in transformation to that ideal end state. So I think the short answer is, yeah, we needed to change some of our structure to make those data-driven decisions, as opposed to the colloquial anecdotal stories of Joe Smith. Like I said, and apologize if there is a Joe Smith in Pennsylvania. I promise I'm not picking on you. Where he's saying that there's a lot of change, and turns out that it's not that much compared to maybe John Aronson in Massachusetts, right? Like similar job functions, just different set of personal circumstances that are making them feel like it's a different amount of change. So having that data to back it up was crucial, because we would have kind of oversized voices in the room sometimes that weren't necessarily an accurate reflection of what was going on in the organization. And so having that data helped really kind of level set and make sure we were all saying the same things.
Yeah, there's always stakeholder groups that have very loud voices, isn't it, in the room, and they try and dominate when it's not necessarily fact-based, some of what they're saying. Yeah, we've all seen those stakeholders in the past. So, Christian, for other change practitioners that would love to, utilize change data to influence their senior stakeholders, what are some of your recommendations for them?
Yeah, so first and foremost, make sure that you're standardizing which data you're collecting. Nothing to me is more frustrating than if I'm collecting apples and somebody else has oranges and trying to mash those together. You really have to make sure that you're collecting the same data and that it means the same thing. I think we talked a little bit earlier about the amount of change, or the hours of change, making sure that you have vet those, because it took us, quite frankly, several iterations, several cycles of coaching and reviewing to make sure that the data that they were capturing really was what they were thinking it was, or recommending that it was. Secondly, getting buy-in from the stakeholders. So for a lot of us, a lot of our time was spent meeting kind of offline meetings with the PMs, with the sponsors, to make sure that they understood, and we were presenting what they wanted in a way that was useful to them. So having that alignment across all levels of the organization, from the change practitioner to the senior executive, was critical. Um, and then the third thing I think for using data, oftentimes people use the data to support how they feel, but really having an open mindset when you're looking at the data to see if it's telling you something that maybe you weren't aware of or different to what your initial hypothesis was. That was certainly challenging for me at times because I feel like my intuition's always right. And so the data will match it no matter what. But I found that if I was open to what the data had to say, it was much more impactful for the organization to make those data-driven decisions.
Yeah, really, really great insights, I think, for everyone to learn and leverage. Thanks so much, Christian, to share with us, your journey of, using change data, working with senior stakeholders, influencing um, how they decide, in terms of change and transformation. Really great, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, you, and thanks for all your support through all this. It's been really fantastic working with you.
Thanks, Christian.